right, good morning everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me today. It's a great pleasure to be here to see young faces and young people that are going to work in this exciting field. So today I'm going to present this work that is a collaboration work with MIT that was funded by the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, SMART, and also by the Ministry of Defense in Singapore, MINDEF. Let me show you the team. So these are all the faces of all the people that have been involved. You can see my collaborator at MIT at the bottom right, number 9, Professor DQ, and the rest of the team. So essentially the idea is that they are from the Ocean Engineering Department at MIT, and they had a design of a floating buoy that we essentially redesigned for the sake of performing swarming. And this was made here in Singapore. All right, the goals and objectives. So essentially, we looked into pervasive monitoring and trying to monitor the coastline or the ocean and even water bodies in Singapore. We have many reservoirs, and these are fairly large extent of water. And we want to look at features that are changing over time. So dynamic features. These could be like thermal plumes or even like pollution. For instance, you have, this is a recurrent problem in Singapore, algae bloom, not just in Singapore, but in Singapore it's happening almost every year. Algae bloom, you have massive algae bloom in the middle. You have lost objects, cargo ships. If you've seen the Marina Bay in Singapore, you have like large containers everywhere. And could be pH, it could be pollution control. So all of these are things that are in the water environment changing over time, and you want to have a system capable of tracking that. So if you look at the different options, I mean, actually there are many monitoring techniques existing, but they essentially depend on the size, on the scale of the system you're trying to track. So let me start on the left side with the larger scales. If you look at the entire ocean, or if you look at very large systems, oceans, seas, and huge lakes, for instance, well, you can use satellite images. And through satellite images, you can have infrared, you can have access to the evolution of the water surface temperature, for instance, and this is pretty well established. Now, if you look at something at a smaller scale, then people are using moored buoys. This is in the Indian Ocean. You also have now drifting buoys in the Atlantic Ocean. These are good solutions on a fairly large scale. Now, if you look at a much smaller scale on the right-hand side, you can have individual sensors. These are anchored buoys, which are measuring properties. So this one, for instance, is one that we have in Singapore. There are 8 of them managed by the National Environmental Agency. But essentially, there is a gap between, I would say, 1 and 10 kilometers square. There is no real effective monitoring technique to track dynamic features. So we propose to develop a swarm of autonomous buoys. So these are, the 51 units we have developed jointly with MIT. So let me show you, let me say, first of all, why have we been using buoys? Number one, they're compact. As you can see here, they are packed in a van for deployment. They are omnidirectional. You want them to be able to move, change direction very quickly, right? Self-righting. If you put them at sea, you want to make sure that they always come back in the upright position, and very good at sea keeping as well. So you can achieve, for instance, if you want them to be fixed, they can remain fixed. If you want them to move in a given direction, they should be able to move in that direction. So let me show you a quick movie that is summarizing essentially the design process and the things that have been taken into account. I will try to, it's a very short movie, it goes pretty fast, so I'll try to comment at the same time. These are some of the initial tests. You see some buoys in red and yellow. These are different prototypes, different versions. What you see on the right-hand side, on the top, are the GPS traces. Okay, they are all, we have GPS enabled. So they have been developed as being low cost. Okay, if you need to make many of those, cost is very important. They need to be robust, highly maneuverable. That's why we want to have a buoy. Versatile in sensing. We made sure that we could essentially put different kind of sensors on it. This could be pH, it could be temperature, it could be anything that anyone needs to track and follow in a sense. Right. Okay, so let me say a bit more about this. So we have, since we're doing swarming, we need to be able to communicate. So one key element here is that this system is deploying its own mesh communication network, and for this it's using the XB antenna. We have we have USB interfaces because when we go to the field, we have 50 units, and then we need to get all the data that has been gathered. GPS antenna, that's pretty important. We need localization. When you want to track a specific feature at a given location, you need to know where the other units are such that you essentially share the load of the work. And we also have a computer on board. In this case, we have a BeagleBone. Now we're using, it's equivalent to a Raspberry Pi if you want. It's pretty powerful. And if you think about it, we have 50 computers that are at sea, which means that we have a cluster and we can perform some sort of high-performance computing real-time. What I'd like to emphasize is that when we put that system at sea, there is nothing else. There is no other infrastructure needed. We just deploy them and they operate on their own. They have their own communication, own computation. Everything is integrated. In terms of propulsion, we use three pairs of motors such that we achieve vector propulsion. As I said, communication is through the XB system. It's low bandwidth and low power, but it's very effective. The XB is great because this is providing a dynamic network. Sometimes they are out of range, and the XB system will be able to find a path such that the information is properly shared. So if you want to have all the details, we have a paper in autonomous robots, but essentially this is a block diagram where we have everything integrated in terms of the controllers, in terms of the GPS, and all of this was fully designed by my team here in Singapore. We took the mechanical design of the buoy from MIT, but the integration of the swarm enabling unit and the microcontrollers was performed here. Now, why do we want to swarm? I didn't want to start with that question, and I'm showing some beautiful fish here. Well, if you turn to nature, you can observe essentially swarming, you can have flocking with birds, you can have schooling with fish. And the key reason why we want to do that is because these systems are excellent in terms of scalability. Right? So if you have a large surface area, you can add units and they will continue to operate together. At the same time, they offer robustness. If you remove several units from the system will continue to operate. And that is probably the most important reason as an engineer why you want to have swarming. Actually, in most of the cases we have been performing, we lost a couple of buoys. When I say lost, well, I mean, you guys over the weekend, you've been performing in a swimming pool, you know what I mean, right? Batteries, battery problem, communication problem. Some of the units just didn't behave according to what we wanted them to do, but that was fine. Overall, the system managed to continue to perform. So robustness is extremely important. And flexibility is something that you maybe you've heard about. It's called swarm intelligence. It's the ability of the system to adapt and change its behavior when the environment changes. And if you keep in mind that with that system, what we want to do is be able to track a dynamic feature in the environment. That's exactly what we want. We want the system to be able to change its behavior if anything in the environment changes. So in order to do that, well, we have some control algorithm that we need to put into the system. So we want to mimic what birds and fish are doing. And what we know from the animals is that, first of all, there is no leader. Okay? All of them, what they do, they only look at their nearest neighbors, and they perform some very basic operations. They perform alignments, so they try to go in the same direction as their neighbors. At the same time, they try to maintain some distance away from other animals. If you look at the fish, they're very close to one another, and in order to do that, they use lateral line sensing. They use pressure sensors on their body in order to maintain a safe distance between one another. So you have attraction, you have alignment, and you have avoidance. These are some of the basic rules that we have in our system as well. So as I said, when you talk about swarming, you want the system to perform as a complete superorganism, if you will, as a unique entity. At the system level, you want the system to do something. But the reality is what we design is a cooperative control strategy where you define the rule at the agent level. So the biggest challenge is how do you map a system level behavior, okay, a global action of the swarm, into local update rules for each and every agent. All right, so let me move on to some of these examples. As I mentioned before, you want to achieve avoidance, alignment, attraction, but in some cases what you want is just alignment, right? Say that you want all your buoys to go in one direction and follow a leader, you just want to have alignment. In other cases, you want to have repulsion because you want to cover a given surface area, all right, like area coverage. So I'm not going to go through all these equations. I just want to mention that for each of these building block behaviors, essentially you have a simple rule which is embedded into the control algorithm of the buoys. So this is an example of a test, right? So each dot here represents one of our buoys. So this was performed in one of the reservoirs in Singapore, the Buoys Reservoir. And initially, the initial position is the blue dot here. So they all started, you know, they all spread. And we told the buoys, now you need to perform what we call rendezvous in space, meaning that we ask them to self-organize and decide to meet at a given location. So what I want you guys to understand is, at this point, we don't tell the buoys to go at the center here, right? If you see where they're all gathered at the end, we don't tell them that, right? What we tell them is, find a place where you guys want to meet. So all the buoys, by themselves, they will collectively decide on the meeting point. Right? So we spread them in any way, you change the initial conditions, and they decide, and we observe. So we do the deployment, we just, you know, essentially relax, stand back and observe what they're doing. So as I said, the blue dots are the initial positions, red dots is halfway through, and the black dots is the final position. So as you can see, by themselves, they have been sharing information where they were, and they managed to perform what we call aggregation or rendezvous in space. Another example, as I mentioned, is what we call leader-follower. So I just want to explain that when we say leader-follower, in this system, there is no real leader. Okay? We say that because we essentially take control of one agent, and every other agent continues to swarm. Okay? So this is still a fully decentralized and distributed system in a sense. And this kind of example is interesting because that's exactly what you have in school of fish and flock of birds. When there is an attack, you will have, say, 1 or 2 fish that are going to see the threat, and the rest of the school will not see anything. And these 2 fish that detect the threat, they will behave in a specific way, and they will, in a sense, you know, become some sort of leader. And their behavior, like their evasive maneuver, will propagate through the entire school of fish. So that's exactly what we have been doing here, meaning that if you look at the blue path here, this is one buoy that we took control of. And we essentially decided to get it to go in that direction. And we told the rest of the system, now you need to perform some sort of collective behavior so that you stick together. And you perform, here in this case, it's heading consensus. You try to get consensus in the direction in which you're traveling. And as you can see, the pack here, the black dots, so the gray lines represents the traces or the trajectories, if you want, of all the buoys. This is again a test that has been performed at the Buoys Reservoir. And most of the group managed to follow the leader, in a sense. And the red one here is one that, performed half of the way, right? But as we said, we're highlighting this because the system continued to operate, right? This is showing robustness, essentially, in the operation of the system. Although one of the buoy had a problem, and we don't know what problem, but it stopped working. It was initially working and later on stopped working. Well, the rest of the group kept operating as required. All right, let me move on to a more interesting case. This is the problem of area coverage. And I'm saying that it's more interesting because if you look at the ocean and say that you have a large surface area that you want to cover, and you want to have your sensors that are spread, you know, in order to cover the entire area. So you have to think of each buoy is essentially a moving sensor. So we have a dynamic mesh network of sensors. And the question is, how do we position them such that we have the best coverage of the entire area? What you don't want to have is you don't want to have 3 or 4 sensors that are clustered in one region, and then you have a region where you have a low coverage. If you do that, very likely you're going to miss on some of the interesting features of the field that you want to measure. All right, so the goal here again is to spread, to have an optimal spreading of the buoys. So this is a test that we have performed near Buoys Reservoir. So let me explain to you what we've been doing. On the bottom here, what you see are the GPS positions in real time, right? You have the GMT time, and each black dot represents an actual buoy, and you have a buoy number. I think for that test we had approximately 20 of those. And you will see the exact image of the field view here. Well, it would have been great to have a drone flying, overhead and have a bird's eye view, but well, in Singapore, it's a big challenge to fly vehicles like this. Especially at this location is close to an airbase, so we had to use the camera from the side of the reservoir, so the view is not great. We're good engineers, but essentially we're not very good at shooting movies, so you have to bear with us for that. So what you're going to see is you have to look at the circle here. You see this red circle. So initially we tell the system, look, you need to cover this area. And then we change the area into another shape. And the buoys, they have to find their own way to essentially spread and move according to the area. All right, let me start the movie. So, all right, as I said, the movie is not great, but they're moving, right? And just like, animals in the flock, you have a lot of fluctuation, but that's good. And we go from a circle to this kind of peanut shape now. And I think you've observed that all the buoys by themselves, right? I repeat, they decided, they found a way to move in order to redistribute and occupy this space. So this is pretty cool because this is called dynamic area coverage. The problem of static area coverage has been studied for a long time, but in this case, we keep changing the surface that they have to monitor. And this is, in practice, this is what will happen if you're trying to track say an oil spill, right? The oil spill will just spread as well. So you need your system to be capable of spreading and matching that. You probably noticed that a couple of buoys misbehaved, right? Again, this is unavoidable, right? So even in our team, we keep having these problems. What I'm not showing here is that this was in the field with mosquitoes and all the buoys, we have 50 of those. So we need to lift them up, we need to put them in the van, we need to unload the van, we need to deploy them, and we're doing that in a place where there is essentially nothing really around like you guys where the swimming pool, but the hot temperature, the mosquitoes, and then in the end, all the buoys that were not behaving properly, well, we had to get a kayak and pick them up, right? So that's part of the fun of doing these kind of experiments. The good thing, though, is that in our problem, and like what you guys have been doing, we are, only touching the surface, right? We don't go in the water yet. So if everything goes according to plan, they're not supposed to sink. So far, we haven't lost one, right? But this is something that I think if we lose one and it sinks, we'll probably ask Amy to come, right? Or we might just leave it there, right? I know it's pollution, but I never happened so far. Anyhow, these are some of the results, right? So performing these operations are cool. At the same time, we need to measure, quantify the actual operations of the system. So in order to do that, we use a metric to essentially measure how effective is the spray. Without getting into all the details, let me just, you see over there, a tessellation. So this is how we divide the space, essentially measure what is the amount of space that each buoy has to monitor. And what we want is, we want these small pieces of the area to be as equal as possible. You don't want to have one buoy to have a larger space to monitor than the others. And what we've been doing tests of scalability. So what you observe here is what happens when we add more units. So we started with one, okay, this is the graph here. That's scalability here, right? So we started with one, and then we've been adding one more buoy, and so on and so forth, until we had like approximately 20. And you see that the performance of the system, right, it's improving, and then you have, once we have 20, we have enough buoys. And if you increase the size of the system, well, you just need to add more units. The system is designed for scalability. We've been performing another test of flexibility, and flexibility, I mentioned, is swarm intelligence. It's the ability of the system to respond to changes in the environment. And this test was the test that is at the bottom right here, where we changed the surface to cover from a disk into this peanut shape. And what we see is that, well, the system, of course, has more troubles when you change the shape, but the system is reorganizing itself, again, without us intervening, and in order to adapt to the change in this. So we've been performing a range of tests like that, even trying to split into 2 groups, and that's something we performed at the Bedok jetty in the ocean. All right, because I understand that you guys have been working on underwater vehicles, and you're probably wondering why I'm talking about surface vehicles. Well, the idea is that in the future, we can look into what we call heterogeneous swarming. Heterogeneous swarming will be a system where you have drones flying, right, overhead, and then you have surface vehicles such as these buoys, and then you can have 1 or more underwater vehicles that will essentially, be loaded with sensors and so on, that will have like a great maneuverability in order to go underwater, gather information. This information can be sent in a way, right, to the surface buoy. And I think this is a good, interesting example because, as I said before, it's very easy to get a floating platform, right? You have Archimedes' principle on your side, right? They are floating by themselves. I mean, of course, if you have a good design of the platform, but they're just floating by themselves, so you can stop the motors and you can save energy, for instance. And at the same time, you have all these computers available, right? If you have 50, 100 buoys like that, you have almost like a supercomputer at your disposal. So you could send all the information you have measured from underwater, you send it back to the buoys, and then you can run through this supercomputer, you can run some environmental models in order to post-process the information. And once you have post-processed the information, what do? What do you think you do, right? You measure, you have sensors, you measure something, you send information, you make a model of the environment, then you send this back to the AUVs, right? And then they decide, maybe I should go in that direction or I should go in this direction, right? So this is a vision for the future in a sense, and there is nothing that prevents us from using drones as well, right? So we could envision a system where we have teaming, swarming, where we have drones flying overhead, where we have surface vehicles with, given that they're floating, you can have many batteries, you can have recharging systems, you can have computing resources, and then you have underwater vehicles that are doing the hard job, right? So that's the concept of heterogeneous swarming. But at this point, what I'd like to mention is that we've been working hard on essentially making platforms that are very inexpensive. Okay? As engineers, we have to be mindful of the cost and the budget. And if you try to make a swarm, if you try to make 50 units, then you have many problems, right? Problems, of course, of quality control, because you need to make 50 units that are as good as possible, right? As identical as possible, otherwise they will behave in a different way. And at the same time, everything has to be mass-produced. Over the past couple of days, you have been making 1 unit, and I'd like you to think, what will you do differently if you had to make 50 times the same unit? And at this point, you probably realize that there are many things you've been doing many times, right, cabling, that you probably don't want to do 50 times. So you need to really think hard in how you design your system such that you can do mass production and mass assembly. And also, as I said, when you go to the field, you need to turn them on, right? You need to deploy them, so it's not just 1 unit. So the issue of scalability in swarming is critical. And lastly, my point is, we are right now working on the underwater. What I mentioned before, I'm working with a colleague of mine at SUTD where we try to have soft robotics going underwater, essentially sharing information with the buoys at the surface. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.